Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our session on how to accelerate developer velocity with Cloud Workstations. My name is Lauren, and I'm the content manager for the Google Cloud community. Joining us today are Google Cloud product managers, Nate and Marcos, who will be taking us through the session content and answering your questions live. So if you do have any questions, those are encouraged. So please feel free to add those into the YouTube chat box, and we'll be sure to get to them either in the chat or at the end of the presentation. There were a number of pre-submitted questions that we received as well, so we'll be going through those first. And any questions that we don't get to live, we'll answer them in a recap post in the Google Cloud community, and there's a link to that in the YouTube description. All right, enough of that. I'll hand it over to you to take us through our content today.
All right, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Let me go to the next slide. So, hi, everybody. My name is Marcus, product manager working in Cloud Workstations, and also joined here by Nate. All right, so let's start with our content here. So today we have a heavy deck we'll be going through, trying to aim, let's say, for maybe 15, 20 minutes. Start by giving you a high-level overview of what is Cloud Workstations, talk a bit about best practices, then I hand over to Nate to give you folks a nice live demo so you get a sense of how it works, and then try to use the bulk of the time to address questions you folks may have. So as Lauren mentioned, don't feel shy, please feel free to ask any questions you have top of mind directly on our Q&A, right? All right, so first thing here, what is Cloud Workstations, right? So essentially, Cloud Workstations is essentially a service providing managed development environments on Google Cloud, right? So you can see what it looks like here on the right-hand side, where you can see essentially an IDE. And the main thing it does is it focuses on providing value to two different audiences. So one is developers. Let's say developer writing applications, services, or code. The idea here is you can go to your browser, and with an URL, you get an on-demand and available anywhere development environment. The key idea here is both having pre-configured environments with all the tools you need, while also ensuring consistency across your team, essentially minimizing the works on my machine kind of challenges developers have. That's one. But also there's a key interesting focus area here, which is admins, right? So imagine admins being platform teams, IT teams, security managers. The idea here is providing capabilities for those personas to create, to manage not 1 or 10 or 100, but say thousands, a large number of workstations. The key idea here is we support this construct, this resource we call workstation configuration, which essentially defines templates for workstations. So let's say an organization could, for example, have multiple templates, one for the front-end team, one for the back-end team, one for data science. And each of those templates or configurations could have different environment configurations, machine types, and pre-install tooling customized to their specific needs. This allows admins to create these configurations and use those as a way to manage resources at scale while allowing the developers to create workstations on demand, right? So moving on, so that's what Workstations is. What specific problems can I expect it to solve for me, right? So over time, we've been chatting with our customers. We've been hearing three key categories of problems which our customers have been consistently having, right? So the first one is development environment setup. Let's say you're onboarding a new developer to your company, or developers changing projects. One thing we notice is that getting a development environment, getting developer productive may take a long time, and a good chunk of this time is spent just setting up and configuring a development environment, which is something where I believe we can greatly simplify by just having those follow consistent definitions and moving those environments to the cloud and having consistent container-based definitions for those. The second one is security, exfiltration, guardrails. So one thing to keep in mind here is the moment you have your source code stored or sensitive data stored on local machines, you're increasing your attack surface. The idea here is twofold. So one is by moving those to the cloud, you are now ensuring that there's no disk, there is no sensitive data on disk. You're just having data being stored in memory for the files developers are working through. And the second thing here is once you move your environments to the cloud, you can also leverage a series of security guardrails, which were previously mostly used for production workloads, such as firewall rules, VPC service controls, and more that I'll be talking later. The next thing here is developer productivity. So one thing here, which is two key areas. One thing here is make it easier for developers to work with private infrastructure inside the networks while meeting security guardrails and policies of your company. And the second thing is just providing bigger, beefier machines with faster network connectivities just for builds to be able to happen faster, right? So moving on here. Okay, that was the high-level overview. Let me now jump to a product deep dive, talk about some of the elements we have within workstations. And I'll be covering each of these three elements in depth now, right? So the first one here is the idea of development environments ready in minutes. So this is the Cloud Workstations console. And you can see here as a developer, I can just click on the button, create workstation, pick a name from workstation, and then I'll have a choice of configurations to choose from. In that case, I'm just picking a Java environment. What is happening here is I'm picking a standard configuration used for my team. And you see that within a few seconds, I get a workstation created. I can click here on the start button, and within a few seconds, I'll get a development environment up and running. I click on launch. Then, as you expect, I'm essentially getting VS Code, in that case, running in the browser. Where in that case, we're talking about a Java development environment, right? So you have everything you expect from a browser. You can install extensions. You can open files. In that specific case, let's say it is a company using Java. As you can see here, I'm just essentially going through a series of code samples pre-installed at the machine. So you could see this machine being configured to maybe having code samples which are specific to your code base. It's one of the options we have here. Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is this machine now has all the extensions pre-installed for working with Java. It even has a JDK pre-installed. The idea here is from the get-go, you're ready to start reading and writing code versus spending time getting the right version of your library configured and ready to go, right? So next slide here is just a deep dive here, right? So as I mentioned before, consistency of environments is one of the key focus areas we have here. As I mentioned, you can create configurations. And what configurations do essentially specify the machine type and the environment you want your developers to use. The way through which you specify an environment is essentially via a container image. So the idea here is essentially you can write your own Docker file. In that case, for example, installing a series of Java tools and code samples based on what I had before, and have this become the blueprint of your development environments, and then have that be applied to all your developers joining your project, while also providing a convenient way of doing dev environments as code, because now you can host that on GitHub and have multiple people contribute to the same shared development environment definition your team uses, right? So next one. So another big thing I want to mention here is we've been taking a strong focus on being ID agnostic when building Cloud Workstations. The key idea here is supporting, let's say, whatever IDs developers use, be that VS Code, IntelliJ, Golang, PyCharm. The idea here is to meet them where they are and allow them to use their favorite IDs in order to get the benefits of cloud environments without requiring any changes on their workflows. And you can see here some of the IDs we support nowadays, with JetBrains Fleet coming soon to the families of IDE supported. Next thing I want to mention here is you saw one mode before, where workstations can be accessible directly via the browser, but there are also other ways to access workstations to provide more flexibility. So as you can see here, there are two different modes, right? So on the left-hand side, you're essentially seeing one using a IntelliJ IDE to connect to remote workstation, essentially using a local IDE, SSHing to a remote Cloud Workstations to provide your backend, essentially where all the heavy compute is happening. And you can see the same thing on the right-hand side, where you can essentially have your local VS Code installation via remote SSH, be able to connect remote workstation to get essentially the workflow you're used to for local IDs, while you're benefiting from a bigger and more secure remote development environment. In addition to this, we also provide SSH tunnels, so you can also access directly via SSH, or also allow the ability to create TCP tunnels, so you can expose more complex kind of setups here. Moving on, next thing I want to mention here is in terms of enterprise readiness. So one key element we saw many of our customers needing is the need to have the environments, the development environments, be inside the virtual private cloud and inside their projects. So the key idea here, workstations, is we're creating all, despite that being a managed service, we're creating all the resources directly within your virtual private cloud, which means then you get benefits such as access to other resources within your private network without meeting transitive peering issues, VPC service controls for additional security prevention, the ability to have a fully private ingress and egress to ensure that only people that are already VPN'd inside your network can access workstations, and typical elements such as network tagging or applying policies to those resources. For example, you may want to have a weekly backup policies on your disks, so you can keep track of the disks you have in case of an outage or an issue, right? Moving on, so still on the enterprise readiness space, as I mentioned before, those environments are consistent. One thing which we do here to simplify fleet management is the idea of allowing central management of development environments. So as an administrator, you can essentially go to a page where you can get a single view showing you all the different configurations you have. And let's say you want to update the configuration, the workstations of a specific team. All you need to do here is open all the configurations, modify the configuration settings, and the next time your developers start a workstation, they'll get all those environment settings automatically updated to reconcile and match the central environment, the central definition of your configuration. So as you can see here, to simplify things such as IAM permissions, forced updates, and image patching, right? One last thing I want to also mention here is support for self-hosted DevOps tools. The key idea here is development teams have a myriad of DevOps tools, which they've been selecting, benchmarking, optimizing over time to enable them to benefit from cloud dev environments without needing to change the workflows. The key idea here is for our services to, since it runs inside of VPC, it enables you to use any kind of tools you see being useful. So you can use our first-party tools, such as Cloud Build, Cloud Deploy, but you can also use external services, self-hosted services like GitLab, TeamCity, or even on-prem remote cloud services. Due to this architecture I showed you before, it's easier to get, let's say, the networking connectivity working between the services. Folks, that's it for the deep dive. I'll now pass on to a quick overview of recommended best practices before we jump into the demo, right? So, all right, so what you have here are some best practices which are essentially reference points for our customers, right? So we had multiple cases. We work with customers seeing what works better or worse for them. There's essentially some guidelines, not to say not must have, essentially can pick and choose them as you fit. But interesting to say policies or best practices we've been learning over time that were shown to be useful for our users, right? So the first idea here is using this concept of development environments as code, right? So as I mentioned above, our environments are defined as containers. And one thing which is saw being helpful for the sake of enabling agility and environment consistency across teams is this idea of having your environments be defined by a Docker file, which is hosted in a GitHub Git repository, and then allowing your developers to submit pull requests to modify that specific Docker file. And once requests are accepted, you trigger an automatic CI/CD pipeline which rebuilds and redeploys that image back to the configuration. That way, essentially, you are allowing your developers to, with a single line of code, modify not only their development environment, but also get the very same change patched across everybody else's dev environments. That's one thing. The second thing we also recommend is enforcing automatic image updates. So Cloud Workstations provides a series of base images. Those base images, they're updated on a weekly basis with security and feature fixes. So if you're creating custom images, we encourage you to automatically update your extended images on a weekly basis to make sure you have the latest version of tools such as gCloud, Cloud Code, but also that we're getting the latest security fixes our team worked on upstream. Third policy here is essentially no code on local machines. This is essentially tied to the exfiltration items I mentioned before. Key idea here is essentially closing the loop on areas where developers can access code, so that the main and the only place they can access code is via a cloud workstations. That way, you're limiting the potential exfiltration points for code to leak to local machines, and it can be directly on the cloud workstation, where you can also apply policies such as beyond corp data loss protection, for example, to limit copy and paste or download of sensitive data from the local endpoints when they're connected to workstations. Fourth principle here is follow IAM defaults. Right, so the defaults we provide in workstations, they follow the principle of least privilege. For example, if you're a developer and you create a workstation, by default, only you have access to that specific workstation. We recommend keeping those defaults to avoid cases where two developers may have access to the very same workstation, but this workstation may have the credentials of one of them. And then you can have cases where credentials may be exposed unnecessarily. And the next item here is essentially disabling direct SSH access to the underlying VMs. So workstations runs on VMs, and you already have the option of using a gCloud SSH tunnel we provide. This gCloud SSH tunnel already enforces authentication and IAM. So to ensure that you are always having these IAM checks happening, recommend customers to have a policy to disable direct access to the VMs within the project, so developers can only go through that specific SSH tunnel. And last one I mentioned here is essentially enabling beyond corp data loss prevention. What it does essentially is monitor for specific patterns of code which are being copied or pasted, for example, regex to matches source security numbers, and blocks the ability for those to be copied or download on the local endpoints. Folks, that's it for the overview. I'll now hand over to Nate to give folks a live demo so you can see what this looks like in practice.
All right, thank you. So Marcos did a great job explaining what it is, but for a lot of people, they have to kind of see it to really experience it and to get it. So I want to just talk about a couple of things real quick. When we talk about those configurations, I'm going to just create a new one and show you some of the things that you see. This was shown earlier where you provide a name, you give it the, you pick your cluster, which is your control plane. You can add labels, which is highly recommended. And then you get here to your machine configuration, and this is where you know, the magic happens. You're picking your size of CPU and such, you know, as well as the memory configuration. What we do recommend is that there's a one-to-one mapping between developer and workstation, which means you may have multiple configurations, and you could set them up like t-shirt sizes, right? A small, a medium, a large, you know, whatever works best in your environment. Speaking of environment, take a look at that. Normal things, you can set your disk size because, of course, some folks are going to need to store more stuff than other folks. So all of that is there, and a quick peek here at those custom container images. These are the ones that ship out of the box right now with our preview. You can see that that support for most of the major IDEs are already there, including IntelliJ. And then one other one, just sort of a follow-up to that conversation about running inside of your VPC. It's also really neat to know that you can also set up private gateways, and it's just that simple. Well, This and some networking stuff you have to do too as well. So what does it look like for you, the developer? The previous screens were what it looks like as an admin, but developers will come in, they'll go to My Workstations, and they'll be able to pick whichever workstation they need. And then it's easy enough to launch it. You just select launch. Now, I happen to have cheated and already had it logged in as well. So we'll go to one of our logged in workstations here. And you can see that it's really just like your normal VS Code, except it's running in a browser and it's hosted on our infrastructure. Now, there are some really cool things here as well, because you'll notice that we support extensions. So you can pick an extension, add it, and let's see here, I'm gonna bring this up a little bit. So you can add a Go extension, Docker extension, whichever ones that you want. You can also pull in VSIX files. And we also ship with Cloud Code. Now, this is really kind of neat because it's a plugin that gives you a lot more insight into your Google services that are running within your project. So I can see here, I can take a look at some of my GKE clusters. I happen to have one here for an app that that I'm working on. Actually, we use it for a lot of our demos as well. So I'm doing some slight tweaks to it. But I can go through, I can find the external IPs, I can pop it open. Gives you the normal security stuff, and then here it is. You also have access to your Google Cloud APIs. You have access to Secret Manager, Compute Engine, all the stuff that you would expect to be able to see. Now, why is this important? We wanted to make sure that developer flow wasn't compromised. We want you to be able to do what you need to do, and for most folks, that's best when they stay in their editor. When they're in their IDE, it's a little bit jarring to kind of bounce around to a bunch of different screens. So this is what some folks would consider the default experience to be, which is when we're using the built-in browser-based version. However, we do have that capability to work with a local IDE, such as the IntelliJ. So we would start here with the JetBrains gateway. Typically, you bring it up. I can take a look at my workstations. And then I would select here. Now, what's interesting here is that both of these are in different projects on the back end within my Google environment. And if I were to launch it, let's go ahead and bring this guy up. Let's see what happens, because I've already, yeah, there we go. It's trying to connect to the local host. Sorry, guys, I am on another machine, or I have multiple monitors running. I'm going to cancel because I also have brought this up earlier. And I wanted to make sure that folks could see it. So some of this stuff was a little bit pre-staged. Sorry about that. But you'll also notice that we have the Cloud Code plugin here as well. And you can also see our Kubernetes clusters right here. I have a different project in this one. I'm looking at a Python-based application, and as you can see, it's just the normal experience because it's all here running locally. So I normally would have all of my same controls and all of my same permissions that I would expect to have, except the processing is happening on the back end. Now, since these are all the same tools, move these over. They would connect to your normal CI/CD pipeline. So I would expect to be able to do a git add, a commit, and then a push, and everything will go just as fine as it normally would. But I think there's one more thing I can quickly show with that developer inner loop. And that's, let's see if I can bring this down a little bit. We can create a simple app. And that simple app, these are just those demo apps that we were talking about before. So let's say I want just a basic hello world. Sure, that looks good. And I'm off and running, right? So these are some of the things that we are attempting to do to make it a lot simpler for developers to just get in and get things going and to make you successful. I guess with that, I'm going to hold, and I guess we can start answering some questions if we have them.
Great. Thank you. Yes, I think, Marcos, if you can advance, we had a few pre-submitted questions. Yeah, actually, we'll go through some of these resources first, and then we'll hop into the questions. So thanks, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Marcos and Nate, for the demo. Really helpful information. And as we said at the beginning, if you're just joining us, we will be sharing this recording in an event recap post in the Google Cloud community. And that's that first link at the top there. We'd also love to hear your feedback. So if you have any ideas for future sessions or any topics or further questions, you can use that second link right there, and we'd love to hear from you. And then lastly, we have a couple of other events coming down the pipe, so you can check those out there, including one tomorrow on making sure you're setting up your organization or project with Google Cloud correctly. So you'll learn best practices for resource management, IAM, and billing. But enough of that, we will start going into your questions. So Marcos, if you want to go to the next couple of slides, these are some of the questions that we received in advance. Will there be IAM access level support per workstation to use, by example, device identity attributes?
That's a good question. I think, just give me a quick minute. Give me some. Yeah, I think it's a good question. Currently, let's say the level of support we have on Cloud Workstations is just essentially regular IAM permissions, right? So essentially, user can, let's say, if I'm a developer, I access my workstation, I have to essentially first log in, I have the permissions to the specific resource before I can be able to access or create workstations. I assume this question is related to the specific IAP-related context-aware access. You're currently investigating integration with BeyondCorp Enterprise. The idea here is enabling both context-aware access policies, for example, only corporate devices or devices from a specific network, and data loss protection policies, right? So in the meantime, the recommendation I have here is the ability to, so we do support the ability to create a fully private gateway. The idea here is in the meantime, you can have only users which are inside your VPC to be able to access workstation. That way you can enforce that only people using your VPN can access the workstation specifically.
Makes sense. All right, our next question, and thank you. I see a few people asking questions in the chat. Please continue to do so, and we'll be sure to get to them. Can we run Windows-based development environments in the near future? For example, some claim that MATLAB runs better on Windows than on Linux, as in, can we stream Windows apps to the browser?
Well, it's a good point. I think Windows-based development environments, so let's not support it today, just to be transparent here, but something we are investigating. So yeah, one thing which we're looking at here now is what about for the very first initial point to be for .NET Core development, essentially the ability to have a local VS Code or local JetBrains writer to be able to access a remote workstation. That's the key path I have here. But if folks see that some of our workloads are having problem on Windows, happy to engage with you to better understand what are the gaps. Folks are meaning to see whether those are addressable on Linux, or do have to really go deeper and use and consider Windows for a specific subset of use cases. Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Can you load any dev tools in the platform, such as .NET code?
Yes. Essentially, the idea, as I mentioned before, workstations are defined as a container image, and you can essentially customize and install all the tools you see fit on a said custom image. You can go to our documentation. We have a few pages which shows search for Cloud Workstations, customize container image. This should show you how you can customize your environment. So I can cover the 3 key ways in which you can customize your environments that we've been seeing our users use. So the first is container build time customization. The idea here is just to go to Node, I modify a Docker file to pre-install libraries or to preload files. What is happening here is essentially once you build your container image, it is taking that specific Docker file into account and writing the container with the tools you have you want there. Essentially, everything happens on build time. The second kind of customization is runtime customization. Let's say, for example, say, hey, I do want my workstations to not only have software pre-installed, but to call a server to download some data which is recent. One example here is I want to run Git update. I want to just update the code I have on my local machine. So what you can do here is essentially modify the entry point script of the container and have that run a bash script of your choice. That should allow you to have things happen when the workstation is starting. That's 2. And the third one is IDE extensions. Another option you can have here is essentially, what if you have a large team of Java developers? One option you can do is just pre-install all the Java dependencies directly in your container, so they have everything which is ready for them to work. So maybe you want to give them a debugger plus language servers. You can just pre-build all of those, so you don't have to worry about having to manually installing this. One thing I just want to keep in mind is environment customization has lots of specific edge cases and variations. So we do see these 3 categories covering the bulk of the needs our customers had. If you have any additional use cases which don't see covered by those, happy to engage with you to discuss workarounds or changes in the product you need to do to support those specific use cases.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to that is you do have local admin rights to the machine, so you're able to make the changes that you need. If there's a one-off field that you need to install the tool, just go ahead and do that.
Oh yeah, it's a great point. Just to add on the information, yes, users by default they get root access, which means yes, you can install everything you want within those machines. They won't be persistent across sections. This allows you to do some basic experimentation before you move on with the other. Good catch, mate. Yeah.
Awesome. It looks like we have a duplicate question from pre-submitted and in the chat. So there is a question around what does it cost, or if there is a cost per week.
It's a good point. I can cover this question real quick. Our pricing is publicly available, so you can just do Cloud Workstation search and Google search to find all the nuances and specifics. But at a very high level, we have a pay-as-you-go model. Essentially, you pay for the resources you use for the periods you used, right? So 3 key categories of costs. First is there's the workstation VM consumption. Essentially, if you're running a VM for a 4-core VM for 4 hours, you're talking about 16 vCPU hours. What you do here, essentially, you pay for the memory and for the compute being used directly to your compute engine, plus a 5 cents per vCPU hour management fee. That's the key cost. In addition, I mentioned before there is a disk mounted to workstation to persist data across sessions. This disk is also charges the typical fees you have within compute engine. And the third thing we have here is a control plane fee. Essentially, to orchestrate the workstations, you need to have a control plane, which is unique per user. This control plane itself costs around 20 cents per hour, which boils down to $140 per month. The way of looking at this, the control plane, in the vast majority of the cases, you need one per customer, per organization, per account. The only cases where we need more than one control plane is when you have 2 or more regions, let's say one developer, set of developers in the US, one in Asia, one in Africa, when I need to have different regions for faster latency. And in the cases where you have multiple VPCs, let's say you have developers developing on different networks, but those tend to be rare edge cases. To give you like a reference point, a sample scenario here. So if you take a developer developing 8 hours per weekday, so from Monday to Friday, using a 4 vCPU VM with 16 gigabytes and 100 gigabytes of disk, you're talking about something in the order of $70 per month per developer, to give you an estimate. Of course, costs will vary depending on your specifications, but that should give you a reference point for the expected costs here.
Super helpful. Thank you. Okay, our next question is, can we start using Cloud Workstations now?
Yes.
Yes, please do. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is right now it is still in preview. It is not yet GA. So there are no official SLAs. However, the service is quite stable at this point. Marcos, anything to add to that?
No, yeah, I think you covered it. I think essentially the project has been getting more and more stable over time. We had a preview launch back in October. Now the service is getting stable. The two key deltas between public preview and GA, there are more, but those are the two key ones. Is one, as you mentioned, SLAs, essentially having some SLA guarantees, as well as support, essentially having a support team in case you have your support eligible. But yeah, please feel free to use now, and yeah, always looking for your folks' feedback and impression on the service. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's the link. Yeah, and you can just go now, cloudgoogle.com/workstations.
Awesome. Yeah, and as we post that recap post in the community too, we'd love to hear from you, your feedback, comments, any additional questions in the comments area there. Okay, we do have one more question that came in through the chat. Is there a way to disconnect a specific persistent disk from one workstation and connect it to another?
It's a great question, and there's not. That's kind of this short answer. I think this is a common feature we've been seeing multiple customers needing. Essentially, the typical use case of either migrating disks between workstations or having an NFS system mounted or a storage bucket mounted. So it's something we're investigating. Potentially with post-GA, we'll be like investigating this one further. In the meantime, what you can do as a workaround is the disks which are mounted workstations are visible. You can just go to Cloud Login, find which disk your workstation has. You can then create a snapshot of the disk, and then decompress the snapshot on a new workstation created. We do recognize it is a bit of, say, a clunky workaround, but it should be something you can essentially create a snapshot, then decompress the snapshot within the new workstation you created.
Yeah, and that's a great point. A lot of times we get a question like this. It's also followed with like, how do I back up my workstation? And it's just that, just back up the persistent disk. It is a disk resource, the same as any other in GCP. So use your standard tools there.
Cool. All right, we have another question here. Is there a public roadmap for this product that you can share? And I do have some information on the community side that I can share, but I'll let you and Nate and Marcos.
Yeah, roadmaps are tricky because the moment you say something, you kind of create an expectation. And some cases you meet that, some cases you exceed, some cases you're a bit behind. So what I can say is areas we're investigating, just to give you a sense of, let's say, what I can expect to happen. So one thing is more IDEs and developer tools, right? So you folks likely saw back in October, we announced JetBrains. We've been hearing from more and more customers asking for, hey, new IDE support. As I mentioned before, JetBrains Fleet is coming soon, but we're also working with some other partners, so you can expect more IDEs to be coming. That's one of the areas of specification here. And the second thing is tooling, which are specific to developer audiences. The second thing I'm doing here is say, what if you are a web developer? What if you are a mobile developer? That's one of the things we're investigating. Okay, what can we do to optimize the experience of these folks, either via custom images or via pre-installed tooling available for them. Yeah.
A lot of cool stuff coming. I wish we could talk more about it.
Love it. Teasers. And I am dropping a link into the chat now. This is a form where you can request access for customers who are under NDA to the public, customers under NDA area of the Google Cloud community, where you can access all Google Cloud product roadmaps that are available. So I do recommend, if you are a customer under NDA, that you check that out, sign up, and we'll make sure that you have access to that and you can see them 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that is all of the questions that we have for today. But if you have any additional, again, feel free to add that into the comments in the YouTube post or follow us up in the community, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you so much, Nate and Marcos, for the presentation today. Maybe we'll have you again to feature updates on Cloud Workstations, maybe sometime in the future, but really appreciate your time. And before we close out, do you have any final thoughts or comments you'd like to share?
No, I think, first of all, thanks for having us here. I think, as you folks saw, we are focused on getting ready for RJ. I think the big thing we'd like to ask folks here is try it out, and if you have any feedback, either go to your support channels or Slack or Twitter, or you can use the hashtag Cloud Workstations tag, which me and Nate frequently crawl after. Yeah, we're always looking for feedback and suggestions, both positive, negative. That's an area which definitely we are always looking to hear more from you folks, and really helps inform our roadmap and ensure that you're building something which is according to what you folks need.
Yeah. Again, everything Marco said, find us, hit us up on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. We're usually pretty active there, and we'll get back to you. Yeah, let us know what you think. We really do want to take that feedback and incorporate it into the product, and pre-GA is the best time to get that info.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next time.